Hello, everybody. So for today's video, what we're going to look at is the war against Nazi Germany, the war in Europe, or the ETO, as American soldiers who fought there called it, the European Theater of Operations. This is actually, of course, a war that begins before America's entry into the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, actually a full 2 years before that with the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. Basically, about a week before the Nazis invaded Poland, they sign a non-aggression pact with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, creating a alliance of sorts with the Soviet Union, even though Nazism and communism are completely distinct and ultimately incompatible ideologies. Um, they basically agree to partition Poland. And a week later, the Nazis roll through the western part of Poland, and a few weeks after that, the Soviets roll through the eastern half of Poland. Um, Once the Nazis invade Poland on September the 1st, 1939, the Western Allies, Britain and France, declare war on Nazi Germany. However, as I mentioned in the previous videos, neither of these countries is really in a position to offer much material assistance. They had really only just begun rearming themselves and remobilizing themselves to face the Nazi threat the previous year in 1938. And as a result, the Poles are basically forced to fight the Nazis by themselves. And although they put up valiant resistance, um, ultimately inflicting significant casualties on the Nazis, in spite of having an army and an air force that was woefully outdated compared to the very modern Nazi juggernaut that they faced. They weren't able to hold on for very long without outside assistance. And so, within a matter of about 6 weeks, by mid October 1939, the Poles are forced to capitulate with the capture of Warsaw, the Polish capital, by the Nazis. And following the fall of Poland, really not a whole lot happens for the 6 months after that. There's actually so little actual fighting in the period between the fall of Poland in October of 1939 and the launch of the massive Nazi Spring Offensive, or Blitzkrieg, in May of 1940, that this period between October of 1939 and May of 1940 is oftentimes referred to as the Phony War, or as some like to call it, the Sitzkrieg, because there's very little actual fighting that occurs other than a few sporadic aerial engagements between German and British and French fighter planes. Um, but that all changes rather abruptly in the spring of 1940 when the Nazis launched a massive combined air, naval, and ground assault, utilizing to the fullest extent that they could, that really they ever did, the new tactics that have been pioneered in the Spanish Civil War, these new Blitzkrieg tactics. Blitzkrieg is a German word that literally translates into lightning war. And so basically, what the Germans had pioneered was very close cooperation between um, armored and infantry, air and ground, and naval units that enabled them to inflict massive damage on their adversaries. It also helped by the fact that the Nazis invading Western Europe in the spring of 1940 were hopped up on meth, because the Nazi soldiers were given a drug called Pervitin, which is essentially methamphetamine. And so that enabled them to stay awake longer than their British and French counterparts. Also, probably made them a little crazier. So the Nazis rapidly advance across Western Europe. They seize the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, And really by the middle of May, by within a week of them launching their offensive on May the 9th, 1940, the Nazis had penetrated deep into France, um, which of course was one of the two principal Allied nations. And really, at this point, it came down to a matter of tactics and experience. The French armies, contrary to what many people may assume or make jokes about the French, their military was actually, in many ways, just as modern as their German counterparts, and their troops were oftentimes just as brave. They just hadn't really adopted to this new style of warfare. The principal means by which the French intended to defend their homeland in World War II was through a series of earthen fortifications known as the Maginot Line, which were easily overcome with the use of paratroopers, and various other means. And so basically, the Nazis are able to rapidly overrun French and British forces in Western Europe. And it's at this point that there's a change in government in the UK. Neville Chamberlain, the man who had agreed to appeasement with Adolf Hitler, is out, and Winston Churchill, one of the few voices in government during the 1930s who would encourage resistance to the Nazis, is in as prime minister. And pretty much as soon rather as Churchill is made prime minister, he's faced with a critical choice. Um, by late May 1940, it's apparent that the French are not faring well, and are likely going to be overrun by the Nazis and eventually be forced to capitulate, which they eventually do on June 22nd, 1940. And so Churchill is faced with the very real question of should Britain fight on alone, um, with the likelihood of France being knocked out of the war, or should it seek a negotiated um, solution? Ultimately, Churchill makes the fateful decision at this moment, probably one of the most momentous decisions in the history of Western civilization of the last 100 years, to keep fighting, and he orders the British Army in France to be evacuated, or as much of the British Army that's in France to be evacuated as possible. This results in what comes to be known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, where the British Royal Navy, aided greatly by the requisition of civilian pleasure crafts, some of which were crewed by civilians themselves, though that's one of those kind of myths that has been kind of exaggerated. Most of the civilian pleasure craft present at Dunkirk were crewed by Royal Navy crews. They just requisitioned them from their civilian owners, but some were in fact crewed by the people who owned them. But anyway, so the British do manage to evacuate most of their army, over 300,000 men, including about 100,000 French soldiers, from the beaches of Dunkirk in the last week of May and the first week of June 1940. Um, but and Churchill responds to this, arguably this defeat, by delivering one of the most famous speeches uh, in history, in which he pledges that the British people, we shall fight them on the landing grounds, we shall fight them on the beaches, we will fight them in the hills and streets, we shall never surrender. This very famous and very inspiring speech. And he delivers this thing to rouse the morale of the British people, which it succeeds in doing. The problem is that even though the British are feeling pretty good about having evacuated their army from Dunkirk, their military situation is still pretty bad. Although the British Army had been evacuated from Dunkirk, they'd been forced to leave behind virtually all of their heavy equipment, all of their tanks, all of their trucks, all of their many of their anti-aircraft guns and artillery. And so basically, by this point, with Western Europe solidly under the Nazi thumb, and the United States still avowedly neutral, um, Churchill's situation looks pretty desperate. And really, the only thing keeping the British from falling is their navy and their air force. And so, over the next several months in the summer and early autumn of 1940, a desperate battle is waged over the skies of southern England, where the British Royal Air Force, outnumbered at some points of the battle by a factor of 4 to 1, manages to fend off a Nazi aerial offensive that was designed to pave the way for an eventual ground invasion, dubbed Operation Sea Lion. And so ultimately, the Battle of Britain, as it comes to be known, becomes the first battle in human history to be decided entirely from the air. It also ends up being the first victory in the Second World War for the Allies, with British pilots ultimately succeeding in inflicting heavy enough casualties on the incoming Nazi bombers and fighters that Hitler eventually indefinitely postpones his planned invasion of the British Isles. The cost for this, however, is horrific. The Germans, part of the reason they lost is because the British were able to take advantage of the limited range of German fighters. They were able to take advantage of the sophisticated early warning system that the British Royal Air Force had put in place, which employed new devices such as radar that enabled them to maximize their relatively limited numbers. But ultimately, the biggest reason why the British were able to prevail in the Battle of Britain is because the Germans, for reasons that to this day remain unclear, shifted the focus of their bombing offensive in late August from attacking British industrial targets and aerodromes to attacking civilian population centers like London and Birmingham and Liverpool and even as far as Belfast in Northern Ireland. And this campaign of what can best be described as terror bombing inflicts horrific civilian casualties. As many as 50,000 British people perish as a result of what comes to be known as the Blitz between the summer of 1940 and early 1941. But ultimately, uh, it does provide enough breathing room for the British Royal Air Force that they're able to recoup and regroup, and they inflict heavy enough losses that the Nazis are forced to indefinitely postpone their planned invasion of the British Isles. Winston Churchill, remarking upon this victory, stated, "Never in the fields of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," referring to the British pilots that had defended the skies over Great Britain. Um, Ultimately, the Battle of Britain does provide an important moral victory for the Allies, and on the American, in terms of building public support in America, it's also important because many Americans come to identify and sympathize with the stoic, stiff upper lip that the British displayed during the Blitz, which definitely increases public sympathy and public support in the United States for American involvement, which is, of course, ultimately crucial in the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in January of 1941. Um, that said, the Battle of Britain doesn't really relieve the pressure on the British or lessen the danger. Arguably, the biggest danger facing the British still lurked beneath the waves of the North Atlantic in the form of the German U boat threat. Much as in the First World War, the Nazis during World War II employ submarines or U boats as a means of attacking Allied shipping. However, in the decades that had intervened since World War I, submarine technology had advanced to a certain degree and had become a lot more sophisticated and, by extension, a lot more deadly. And the Nazi attacks on British and, after December 1941, American shipping proved to be a significant enough threat, threatening to cut off Britain's lifeline to North America, to Canada, to the rest of its empire, and to the Commonwealth, as well as to supplies coming in from the United States, that Churchill considered it the most serious threat to Allied victory during World War II. As a result of this, he creates a special team of cryptanalysts at a place called Bletchley Park in the outskirts of London, who are tasked with cracking the German naval code, which comes from something called the Enigma device, which was basically like a typewriter, but it produced codes that could be done in combinations in the hundreds of millions of potential combinations. This enabled German submarines to communicate with one another, to coordinate their attacks, and inflicted devastating losses on Allied shipping. Eventually, in the spring of 1941, a team of British cryptanalysts, led by Alan Turing, who is generally considered to be the father of modern computer science, break the German Enigma code, which creates this classified secret throughout that lasts for many decades, known as Operation Ultra, that enables the British and eventually the U.S. and Soviet Union to basically read the Nazis' mail, to know what they're planning and to know how they're responding to Allied actions, which ultimately proves a decisive factor in victory, not only in the Battle of the Atlantic, but ultimately in the war itself. In addition to breaking through the German Enigma code, another factor that eventually tips the scales in what comes to be known as the Battle of the Atlantic comes after the United States enters the war, where once again America's enormous industrial capacity proves to be decisive. Basically, one of the reasons the Germans were able to operate with impunity in the North Atlantic is because Allied aircraft could only reach so far, and there was this big gap, known as the Greenland Air Gap, that the German submarines were able to basically operate with impunity without fear of aerial attack. With America's entry into the war, the U.S. begins building hundreds of these basically converted merchant vessels known as escort carriers that can contain between half dozen and 2 dozen aircraft that are able to gradually close that air gap. That plus advances in sonar technology and depth charges and things like that eventually enable the British and American navies to begin inflicting heavy enough losses on German U-boats by early 1943 that the Battle of the Atlantic is effectively won, and along with it, that makes possible subsequent Allied operations, the supplies that eventually make their way to England, that make possible the Allied bombing campaign, the American invasions of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and eventually the Normandy invasion. All of those things ultimately are made possible because of the ability of the Allied navies to break the German U-boat menace by early 1943. It's really, again, one of the decisive factors in winning the war, although one not as oftentimes given as much attention as other areas. Now, if winning the Battle of the Atlantic is an important part of winning the war against Nazi Germany, an even bigger component in winning the war against Nazi Germany comes when Hitler makes what is generally considered to be one of the two biggest mistakes he made in the war. The first was his decision to declare war on the United States following the Pearl Harbor attack. He didn't have to declare war on the United States. He chose to as an ally of Japan. And in doing so, brought to bear the full weight of America's industrial arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, to bear on the Nazis, something that would ultimately prove to be one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. The other thing that Hitler did that ultimately proved to be a decisive factor that ultimately cost the Nazis the war was his decision in the spring of 1941, 6 months before the U.S. entered the war, of attacking the Soviet Union. Now, as I mentioned previously, Hitler and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had, in August of 1939, signed a non-aggression pact. But Hitler, by 1941, had become restless, stymied in his efforts to invade the UK, invade Great Britain, he turned his attention eastward. And here, Hitler was thinking in terms more related to to the Nazis' racial ideology than anything else. Hitler regarded the people of the Soviet Union as essentially Untermenschen in the Nazi terminology, subhuman, and wanted to clear the Soviet Union of its inferior population to make way for new not for the new master race. The Nazis referred to this as Lebensraum, or living space. And so he plans an attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. Uh, it initially succeeds, partly because of Stalin's own paranoia. Stalin is not a good guy in any stretch of the imagination, and his own paranoia had ultimately hobbled his own country's military defenses. Stalin was one of those people who was constantly convinced that there was always plots against him, and in 1938, he had purged a sizable portion of the Soviet officer and NCO corps. And as a result, the people leading the Soviet military, the Red Army and Red Air Force, in the spring of and summer of 1941 were generally people who were, kind of sycophants for Stalin than they were actual soldiers. And so the first few weeks of the Nazi invasion go really bad for Stalin and for the Soviet Union. Within that 6 week period, the Nazis managed to overrun an area in Eastern Europe, including the eastern parts of Poland that the Soviet Union had taken in 1939, as well as modern day Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, parts of the present day Ukraine, as well as parts of modern day Belarus and European Russia. They managed to take over an area of land more than double the size of France in that 6 week period. And they take more than 3.5 million Soviet soldiers as POWs. And they advanced to within 50 miles of the Soviet capital, Moscow. At that point, a couple of things happen. The first is Stalin, after kind of basically losing it after the initial Nazi invasion, he stops panicking, and he issues this famous general order to Soviet troops, ordering them to, not yield a further inch of Soviet territory of the Soviet motherland to German troops. This famous "not one step backward" order, an order which occasionally is enforced with the use of special so-called blocking troops of the Soviet NKVD, the Soviet secret police, who basically shoot anybody who retreats without prior authorization, essentially giving Soviet soldiers a pretty grim choice between either being killed by German bullets or their own bullets. But ultimately, the strategy works. The Soviets managed to stabilize their line in front of Moscow. They're significantly reinforced with massive arrivals of troops from Siberia and Asiatic Russia. And they also are saved essentially by the weather. At this point, the Soviet Union is still a very underdeveloped country, in spite of Stalin's collectivization efforts, and its roads were still largely dirt. And so in the autumn of 1941, there's massive rains that turn the roads into mud, and that rain is very quickly transitions into snow and a rapid drop in temperature that sees temperatures drop to 30, 40 degrees below zero. Hitler and the Nazis essentially had made the same classic mistake that Napoleon had made when he invaded Russia in 1812. He did not prepare for a winter campaign, and so ultimately the Nazi tanks quite literally froze in their tracks on the hardened Russian roads. And so the combination of ferocious, oftentimes incredibly costly counterattacks launched by Soviet forces, plus the weather, ultimately checks the Soviet advance in front of Moscow. Now, at this point, the United States has entered the war by early 1942. It's still not really quite ready to provide much support. It won't really do so until November of that year, when American forces invade North Africa. But Hitler is increasingly cognizant of the material industrial advantages that the U.S. provides. And so in 1942, having failed in his efforts to capture Moscow, um, Hitler turns his attention southward towards the vast oil reserves of the Soviet Caucasus, the stands basically, along the Caspian Sea, which was and is one of the most oil-rich regions in the world. And so German forces shift their attention from Moscow. They head southward through the west, through the Ukraine, and they make their way towards the Caucasus. Initially, they make great progress, but then they ultimately come across stubborn resistance in a strategically insignificant city along the banks of the Volga River, a city that Hitler becomes absolutely obsessed with taking, the city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, of course, had been named by Stalin for himself, dictator, and Hitler becomes just absolutely obsessed with taking the city, to the point that he redirects an entire German army, the Sixth Panzer Army, to taking the city of Stalingrad. This results in intense street fighting to try to take Stalingrad, which is essentially reduced to rubble that proves to be the perfect place to wage urban combat for Soviet forces. Ultimately, the German army gets bogged down in this intense urban combat in Stalingrad, and the Soviets then manage to launch in the autumn of 1942 to launch a massive counterattack that completely surrounds the German forces attempting to take Stalingrad. And so for 3 months, between November of 1942 and February of 1943, the encircled German army and the Soviet forces in Stalingrad fight a bitter battle. A battle that ultimately will go down as the bloodiest single battle in human history. Upwards of between 1 and 1.5 million people are killed in the fighting over the next 3 months in Stalingrad. Now, to put that in perspective, that lower figure, 1 million, is more than double the total number of American soldiers killed in the entirety of the Second World War. And it's just a drop in the bucket compared to the eventual 25 to 35 million people that the Soviet Union would eventually lose during the Second World War. During World War II, the Soviets, who, unlike the US and British militaries, did not really show much interest in preserving the lives of their soldiers, they would ultimately lose, like I said, between 25 and 35 million people. 60% of Soviet families would lose an immediate family member during what they would come to refer to as the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany. So it's a testament to the sheer brutality of the Eastern Front, which is ultimately one of the deadliest battlegrounds in human history. It also ultimately accounts for fully 90% of both the casualties inflicted on the Allies during World War II, as well as 90% of the casualties inflicted on Nazi Germany on the battlefield during World War II as well. And so Stalingrad is just one example of this. Now, eventually, in February of 1943, after several failed relief attempts, the German army within Stalingrad, which had been reduced from a fighting force of over 500,000 men to 91,000 starving, freezing survivors, surrenders to the Red Army. And this surrender at Stalingrad in February of 1943 serves as one of the dual turning points of the Second World War against Nazi Germany. The other turning point occurred a few months earlier in November of 1942 when the British Eighth Army, operating in Egypt, inflicted a crushing blow on the German Afrika Korps at the Second Battle of El Alamein. And so these two victories taken together, the British victory at El Alamein and the Red Army victory at Stalingrad, both collectively mark the turning point of the war against Nazi Germany. And they both have something very specific in common. The Afrika Korps thrust in Egypt in the autumn of 1942 was aimed at securing access to the Suez Canal, and along with it, gaining access to the oil fields of the Middle East. And so basically, both of the Nazi campaigns in 1942 were aimed at gaining access to various sources of oil. And both of those campaigns ultimately end in failure. And so it's largely because of that, because of the failure of the Nazis to be able to gain access to a secure source of oil, that their military fortunes begin to wane after late 1942, early 1943. Now, following the Soviet victory at the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin is by this point increasingly paranoid and frustrated with the Allies. He is at this point convinced that the U.S. and Britain were dragging their feet in launching a second front, a main second front against Nazi Germany, which might relieve pressure on the beleaguered Red Army. And so when the leaders of Britain, France, and the United States, the so-called Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, meet at the Tehran Conference in 1943, Stalin basically forces a promise out of the United States and Great Britain that they would open a second front in Western Europe within a year. Now, this is not to say that American forces and British forces were inactive at this time point. As I've already mentioned, the British Army was already heavily engaged with Nazi forces in North Africa, as were American forces after November of 1942 with the invasion of Vichy French-held Morocco, Operation Torch. But ultimately, in 1943, the United States and Great Britain decided to focus, instead of on opening a second front in Western Europe by invading France, they decided to focus their attention instead on attacking what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, by which he meant Italy. Churchill's thinking behind this was basically twofold. He, one, wanted to secure British control of the Mediterranean to, basically reassert British control in its various colonies around the world, many of which were, at this point, pushing for their independence. But the other thing was that he actually thought that Italy, which had performed poorly in the war up to that point, would be easy to knock out, and that doing so would provide a backdoor into Germany up the Italian peninsula. He was half right in this particular estimate. When American and British forces land in Italy in September of 1943, the Italian government does very shortly thereafter surrender and capitulate. Mussolini is taken out of power. He's arrested. The Nazis would subsequently spring him from his captivity, and they do basically fold like a cheap suit when American forces land on Italian soil. But the Nazis anticipated this. And so when it becomes apparent that Italy is going to surrender to the Allies, the Nazis had reinforced the northern half of Italy, which is not only where most of Italy's industry was located, including all of its gun factories and aircraft factories, but it also happens to be extremely mountainous, making it an ideal defensive terrain. And so ultimately, the Italian campaign, this attempt to strike at the soft underbelly of Europe, ends up turning into one of the longest, deadliest, and most protracted campaigns of the Second World War. More American soldiers are killed or wounded in the Italian campaign than in any other American campaign in World War II. And ultimately, that fierce battle through the mountainous terrain of northern Italy lasts for nearly 2 years. It isn't until February of 1945 that American forces finally break through what is known as the Gothic Line and make their way into Nazi Germany, by which point American forces advancing across France had already penetrated into Nazi Germany. So it ends up being a very costly effort whose military merits are still somewhat debated. But that's not the only American military effort in 1943, the Italian campaign. The other major American military effort in 1943, at least against Nazi Germany, is this massive aerial bombardment campaign that the U.S. and the British launch in 1942. In 1942, the U.S. and Great Britain launch a massive aerial bombardment campaign designed to knock out German industry. And basically, it was kind of done in shifts. American bombers would fly during the day, attempting to engage in what they called pinpoint precision bombing, which was anything but. Their idea of pinpoint precision accuracy was 2% of bombs hitting within 1,000 feet of their targets. Needless to say, this requires massive formations of aircraft. We're talking formations of upwards of 600, in some cases up nearly 1,500 planes in the sky at once by early 1944. So American forces attempt to attack military targets, ball bearing factories, U-boat pens, eventually synthetic oil and rubber production, as well as oil facilities in Romania, the Ploiesti oil fields. By contrast, the British fly at night, and they engage in what they call area bombing, which is essentially the deliberate bombing of German civilian population centers in an effort to break morale. Initially, like I said, the United States tries to avoid this. The American bombing campaign does cause extensive civilian casualties. But to quote one historian on this, intent matters. And the U.S. bombing campaign, at least until fairly late in the war, did not deliberately seek to target civilian population centers. Eventually, however, as the war intensifies and as American casualties mount, this restraint does gradually go away. And eventually, by early 1945, you do have attacks like the bombing raid on Dresden that essentially are deliberate acts of what can best be described as terror bombing. And that's an important thing that I think ultimately is instructful in understanding the decision making that eventually would lead in the Pacific to the use of atomic weapons against Japan. Total war does things to people's sensibilities, and World War II was a total war. So that's definitely something that's worth looking at. Now, initially, this bombing campaign is relatively ineffective, and for a time, American bomber crews actually suffer a higher casualty rate than any other branch of the U.S. military. They're actually more American air crewmen are killed during World War II than are killed in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. Eventually, by early 1944, the development of effective long-range escorts causes the bombing campaign to become progressively more and more effective. And as it becomes more effective, the Germans' ability to keep their war effort going gradually diminishes, starting in 1944. Now, this, of course, was the intended effort, the intended idea behind this, that this bombing effort was designed to basically weaken the German war effort and pave the way for the eventual Allied invasion of Western Europe. After several delays, that invasion does eventually go forward on June the 6th, 1944, when the combined Allied forces under the command of future President Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, launched the Operation Overlord, or as it's more commonly known, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion ever mounted. Ultimately, hundreds of thousands of soldiers land across 5 beaches on the Normandy coastline of northern France. 2 American, 2 British, and 1 Canadian. The American beaches are Utah and Omaha. The Canadian beaches, Juneau, and the British beaches are Golden Sword. On all but one of those beaches, objectives are very quickly secured the first day. However, at the 5th beach, Omaha Beach, the preliminary naval and aerial bombardment fails to dislodge the German defenders, and the first waves of attacking American forces suffer very high casualties, and ultimately as many casualties as are suffered on December 7th. And for a time, it doesn't seem like they're going to achieve anything, but eventually, by the end of the day, again, after suffering extreme losses, American forces do manage to secure Omaha Beach, and along with it, the Allies gain a foothold at Normandy to begin their advance and to begin the liberation of Western Europe. Now, after D-Day, the Allied advance gets kind of bogged down for about a month in intense fighting along the hedgerows of the Normandy countryside, a battle that is largely fought by British and Canadian troops in and around the city of Caen. But by July of 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces are able to finally break through the German defenses in Normandy, and they rapidly then sprint across France in the next few weeks. Within 6 weeks of the Normandy breakout in July of 1944, the French capital of Paris is liberated. And by October of 1944, American forces enter their first German city, the city of Aachen, near the French border. And so by late 1944, the war definitely seems to be going decisively for the Allies, and well for the Allies in Western Europe. At the same time, Soviet forces are rapidly advancing from the east. And so it's at this point, with the Allied forces closing in on Nazi Germany from both sides, Soviet forces advancing from the east across Poland, and Allied forces advancing across Western Europe, that Hitler, in a last desperate bid to reverse the momentum of the war, basically gathers up all the remaining gasoline, all of the remaining industrial capacity that the German Reich has left, all of the remaining soldiers he can find, and he launches this massive counterattack in December of 1944 through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, through some of the worst winter weather that Western Europe had ever experienced. This German counteroffensive, which was aimed at driving American and British forces back to the North Sea and to recapture the important port city of Antwerp, eventually creates an 85-mile wide salient in the Allied lines that gives the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. Ultimately, thousands of it's a principally American battle. Thousands of American soldiers are funneled in to fight the Battle of the Bulge. Many of them sent in so hurriedly that they are not given adequate winter clothing. And as a result of this, the Battle of the Bulge, which ends up being the single bloodiest battle that American forces fight during the Second World War, ends up being a battle where about half the casualties suffered by the United States, around 70,000 in all, are from weather-related ailments, frostbite, hypothermia, etc. And only about half are from German bullets. But in spite of this, and in spite of the tenacity of the German fighting in and around, and the stubborn American defense of cities like Bastogne and various other small Belgian towns, American forces are able to eventually push the Germans back. And by January 31st, 1945, the Allies once again resumed the offensive. The Soviets already by this point have resumed their offensive from the east. So by basically the beginning of February of 1945, it's clear that Nazi Germany is done, that they're going to lose the war. At this point, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And so at that point, the question really becomes, what's the peace going to look like? And it's here that some of the more controversial decisions are made. In February of 1945, following the American victory in the Battle of the Bulge, President Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin meet for what will prove to be the final time before Roosevelt's death on April the 12th at the Crimean resort town of Yalta. There, ultimately, fateful decisions are made that will give shape to the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that emerges after the Second World War. Basically, at Yalta, the United States and Great Britain agreed to recognize Soviet control of Poland and Eastern Europe in exchange for a Soviet promise to allow free and fair elections in the territories that their forces had liberated in late 1944 and early 1945. Ultimately, the failure of the Soviets to keep this promise would serve as one of the principal causes of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, that's a bit of a simplification, and we'll get into more specifics about Yalta when we talk about the Cold War, but needless to say, it's a very important moment in shaping the future dynamics of the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Now, while Yalta is happening, Allied forces are rapidly advancing on the Nazi Reich. At this point, the fighting becomes increasingly desperate. The Nazis resort to using conscripted children from the Hitler Youth to attack American and Soviet forces. Eventually, after this fierce fighting in Germany, American and Soviet forces meet up at the Elbe River in April of 1945. And here, another fateful decision that would ultimately have major ramifications for the Cold War is made when General Dwight Eisenhower, future President Dwight Eisenhower, makes the decision to allow the Soviet forces the honor of taking the German capital city of Berlin. His reason for doing so is both because the U.S. had just suffered massive losses in the Battle of the Bulge, and secondly, because of the immense Soviet bloodletting on the Eastern Front. Eisenhower basically felt that they'd earned the honor to take the German capital. And so ultimately, in mid-April, the Soviets launch a massive offensive to take Berlin, an offensive that would eventually claim the lives of more than 200,000 people in World War II's final battle. And it's during this final battle, in the ruined streets of Berlin, beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, that Adolf Hitler, having by this point completely lost touch with reality, commanding armies that existed only in his own imagination, in a moment of lucidity, marries his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, and then the two retire to a chamber in his bunker deep beneath the streets of Berlin, and he kills himself. Both of them kill themselves. A few days after Hitler's suicide, Berlin falls to Soviet troops. And on May the 8th, 1945, the new German government that assumes leadership after Hitler's suicide surrenders to the Allies, thus marking the end of the Second World War in Europe, or VE Day, Victory in Europe. Um, this doesn't mark the end, however, of discussions, as while Allied troops are rapidly advancing across Nazi Germany and Nazi occupied territories in the East, they begin discovering the vast scale of Nazi atrocity that we have come to refer to as the Holocaust. And a discussion about that is going to be the subject of our next video.